Relatively early in the current public health crisis, even though there was a sharp divide in opinion, falling most often upon partisan and ideological lines, amongst an electorate divided in an identity politic that had reached its highest points of division, with most even conceding that their divisions were not political nor ideological but personal, and most often and most passionate amongst progressives who championed science. Voters who received most of their news from what have been called information silos. An astounding 73% of those Americans in the Pew Research Center survey in March stated that they understood the science in the current public health crisis of a novel coronavirus. The clear majority of Americans were very confident that even though an emerging pathogen was beginning to disrupt everything in American life, 73% of those Americans, the same percentage of eligible voters in the Commonwealth of Virginia who did their duty to come out to vote in Virginia, a record-breaking 4.2 million voters, over 2 million of whom came out to the polls during the last 2 weeks of the absentee in-person early voting period. Double the amount of those who chose to vote safely by mail-in ballot during what Attorney General Mark Herring has most often described to the courts in briefs as a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, came out to vote in what Congressman Don Beyer described as the most important election of his lifetime. 73% of Americans in March described themselves as knowing the science of a novel coronavirus, even though most at that time were learning the word coronavirus. The largest in genome mass amongst the most abundant biological particles in the world, the most abundant of that biological form of life, first discovered in animals in 1932 and in humans in 1965. Yet at the same time that this pathogen was emerging as an emerging public health crisis, when adult Americans were confident that they knew everything, just 1 month later, even the scientists were telling the New York Times that they were baffled by a novel coronavirus. Real scientists who do science for a living, while only 6% of those receiving baccalaureate degrees major in biology, only 2% of whom go on to graduate study, and who represent the second highest in underemployed college graduates, not able to work in a job at the level of their education and often not in their field. Over 35% of them, second only to those who major in psychology. At the end of March, when 73% of Americans told research surveys that they had it all figured out, the deputy director for the World Health Organization was telling Julia Boulos at Fox Media that they did not know why it appeared that nobody was even reading their science reports. Their science report that had just stated that COVID-19, on no evidence that they found, was an infectious disease. 73% of Americans, while medical experts at Oxford University at the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine were issuing a manifesto of neutrality to state that they had no idea how even to describe what they were hearing from politicians and from the press, and had decided to retreat to the safety of the halls of academia, while Americans closed the doors on schools, churches, and their businesses. One of the first things that science told reports told them not to do, specifically, but 73% of Americans were yet confident that they knew the science. And today, of half of all adults have volunteered to be vaccinated with at least one shot of what can only be described as an experimental modified RNA attempt to, for the very first time amongst humans, trigger an immune response at the interferon level, and those seeking the convenience volunteered to be administered just the easy one-shot Johnson & Johnson product that has been validated in clinical trials for approval under the emergency use authorization, a special authorization that is very distinct from the new drug application at the FDA to be successful in triggering that immune response for a pathogen for which no scientist can tell you in quantifiable terms the infectious dose nor the secondary attack rate to be successful only 66% of the time. And the scientists actually have no idea if that immune response will actually prevent anyone, be sufficient to prevent them from getting infected, being hospitalized, or becoming a fatality to a novel coronavirus, and no idea what may occur after only 2 months. But 70 and are already telling people that they're going to need probably another shot in under a year. But 73% of Americans by March were confident that they understood the science. And there is a very, very popular phrase: we have met the enemy, and it is us. And it is most often ascribed to a character called Pogo. But probably most Americans could not tell you who Pogo was. It might actually tell you that he is a Chinese philosopher, when actually he was a possum in a cartoon that began in the 1950s, written by a man who used to work for Donald Duck's cartoons at the Walt Disney Studio. One of the things that you will most often hear from a driver who you notice falling asleep at the wheel while driving is that they are awake. And the overwhelming majority of Americans who voted for the current president, who is pushing to achieve 80% participation in the vaccinations program so as to reach what he has described to him as herd immunity, a figure higher than any level ever used in science reports for that purpose of achieving what scientists actually call a herd effect, will tell you that they too are woke. While every Sunday at Roman Catholic Mass, for those who still opt to attend it all, in person or online, there is actually a weekly prayer to pray for those who have fallen asleep in the faith. A prayer most relevant in a time when over 1/5 of churches have closed their doors permanently, and approximately 1/5 of former regular worship attendees have decided to return to their God, who was not bigger than a novel coronavirus measured in nanoparticle units called micron, approximately 350 of which can fill a period at the end of a sentence on a standard sheet of paper, while regular Bible reading, despite 24% of even atheists turning to prayer, among 73% of Americans confident that they fully understood the science, is at an all-time low. And even though scientists couldn't understand an invisible enemy, despite possessing not even any biological training, much less any experience or training in virology or epidemiology, 73% of Americans say that they know what's going on and have it all figured out. In military decision-making, or any decision-making model, the very first and most important step is to begin by recognizing that there actually is a problem. And the journey home for the astronauts aboard Apollo 13, for whom failure was said not to be an option, was to get on the horn to command control. And as soon as they began to hear bangs and shimmies that they had never heard before in training, to inform someone at Houston that they had a problem. But as early as March, when Americans were closing down schools, churches, and businesses for a Frank Miller coronavirus reported to be arriving on the noon train, that even prompted Mohammed Norman Oliver, the state health commissioner who graduated from a college that requires no college entrance exam, to sound the alarm with a declaration of emergency for a communicable disease of public health threat, 1 month before it had actually arrived, a requirement under the law, followed by a declaration of emergency in the Commonwealth of Virginia. After only 45 people in a state of over 8.4 million, a number slightly lower than the number aboard the recently lost Indonesian submarine, and to adopt what a scientist aptly describes as a cordon sanitaire protocol, which ironically is the clinical equivalent of closing the hatch on a flooding compartment in a sinking submarine. But 73% of Americans who were confident that they knew the science found social media friends making profile picture frames about making plans and staying at home. While as late as August, the scientists at the CDC actually had to hire a cartoonist, much like the cartoonist who made Pogo back in the 1950s, revived in the 1990s, to inform 73% of Americans who knew the science where the entrances to their upper respiratory tract were located for purposes of wearing a non-medical grade mask. Declared battle ineffective over a decade ago by the scientists at NIOSH, that Americans chose not based upon any known quantifiable clinical metric, but often on style considerations to protect them from a pathogen that might actually kill them. But 73% of Americans at the very beginning of a public health crisis said that they knew the science. And the majority of Americans who elected the current president are confident that his plan is the correct one, even if science is not political or decided by a majority vote. I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I have ever seen. Whether it is real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing, but with some other perfectly rational cause, is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason. Impossible. So was Xeroxing and holography just a few years ago. In fact, so were videotape replays like the one you're watching right now. People have been claiming an existence of God for thousands of years, and maybe one day we will finally know the answers as to how and why and what. What a tremendous gain that would be for science, but what a tragic loss for storytelling. No one knows the day nor the hour when all mysteries shall be revealed, but we'll be watching and we'll be waiting in earnest, incessant, and fervent prayer for the advancement of the kingdom of God. Be sure to join us next time as events evolve with science and faith in a pandemic election that some have claimed is the presidential election of their lifetime. This is a no-brainer, folks. It doesn't get any easier than this. My name is Major Mike Webb. By God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. If it is to be, it is up to somebody to tell you to do what to do. Let me know how that works out. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. End of the day, I really don't give a damn. It's not my department, honest. And y'all come back now. Here. Honest.